Politics, conflict, and sport. Often exclusive, but not always. And when Germany and Holland meet on the football field, all three are inextricably linked. Shaped as they are by Europe's darkest days. The 1974 World Cup final, the spark that would ignite the rivalry for a new generation.
Our tactic was to surprise our opponents in the first 15 minutes, to try to score as fast as possible. And that worked against Germany.
We thought the Germans, they are not our friends. So let's humiliate them in front of their own fans.
Die gaan we voor hun eigen publiek.
I wanted to be world champion, and it was very clear to me, I'm going to smack the ball in the net.
We missed such a lot of chances, So we played quite well, but the details were not there.
They have always had great teams, but never won anything. Something important, because they didn't have a Gerd Müller.
Maybe we were a bit too sure of ourselves. I think that could well have played a part.
It was all about one of the dark periods we had in Europe, of course, in 40-45.
The Second World War arrived in the lowlands on May the 10th, 1940, when German forces invaded Belgium and Holland.
It was horrible. I was only a child. Their tanks came into the Netherlands, and then they shot at us. But we had nothing to shoot back with, and they just took over. You never lose that feeling. We were so scared, so anxious.
Notemans and his countrymen lived under Nazi rule for nearly 5 years, and the scars of war would never fade.
World War II wasn't really discussed much in Holland for a long time. It was too painful a topic.
Amidst the pain, football provided a tonic. In 1954, Germany surprised everyone by winning the World Cup, defeating Hungary 3-2 in what became known as the Miracle of Bern. 2 years later, Germany would face Holland on a football pitch for the first time since the war.
We all stood there and looked at the Germans thinking, what are we going to do? They were better, so we had to come out strong. We made it 1-0, and the Germans became more powerful and came at us. But we scored again to make it 2-0. The Germans pulled one back, but we did it. It was great. We had beaten the world champions. After the final whistle, it felt like there were about 60,000 Dutch people on the field celebrating with us. It was unbelievable. All of those people on the field, it's something you never forget. No one had expected a small country like ours to do that to Germany.
The shock result was an aberration. A 7-0 drubbing a year later marked the onset of German dominance. And memories of the war lingered, as Willy Lippens, a winger making a name for himself in Germany, was about to discover from his Dutch father.
My father went through the war. He lived in Germany, and he was often picked up, taken away, and was once taken down into a cellar and beaten up. He was really knocked about. Of course, something like that sticks with you. It influences the way you are, and he tried to pass this on to his children.
Lippens' performances for Rot-Weiss Essen caught the eye of the international scouts, but with a German mother and a Dutch father, his choice was a very difficult one.
I said I wanted to play for Germany. Helmut Schön wants me to choose to be German and play for the national team. And then my father said out of the blue, then you needn't come home again. There was a huge uproar at home. Mum was crying. It was just too much, so I thought, sod it, I'll just stay Dutch.
A call-up to the Dutch squad followed, but there Lippens faced other challenges.
I had a bad experience with Rinus Israel. We were on the team bus on the way to the game in Rotterdam, and the driver was fiddling with the different channels on the radio. And suddenly a West German station, WDR Köln, came on. And Rinus called from the back, "Turn that Nazi channel off." I turned around and said, "Right, shall we have a chat about Nazis? This isn't about our generation." And he said, "You're half a Nazi." I should have said, "Stop, let me out. I'm going, I'll play for Germany. End of story." And that's what I should have done. But I was young. I wanted to be an international and play in full international matches.
Lippens went on to play and score for the Netherlands, but he was viewed by his teammates as an outsider. The simmering tensions between the two nations remained and would come to the fore at the 1974 World Cup. The Dutch players, some who had shunned Lippens, shone en route to the final, bewitching fans worldwide with their total football. Perhaps inevitably, their opponents in that final would be the hosts, West Germany. The battle began off the pitch when German newspaper Bild ran a story about a wild Dutch party.
We hadden elke keer wel een feestje na de wedstrijden.
We had a party after every match, but they were just normal parties. However, this time, there were a few journalists present, some from De Bild. They mentioned a story which mentioned Cruyff a lot, and they wrote about some antics in the swimming pool. This affected Cruyff badly. There was some pressure from home, which wasn't helpful at all in the days running up to the final. But I suppose it was our fault. We shouldn't have allowed journalists into our camp. They certainly used it well, and they made it really explosive. And I think that was good for them.
Rinus Michels described German efforts as Cold War tactics, and nothing more than attempted disruption.
The World Cup taking place in Germany, and Germany in the final against Holland. It was all there. That pressure is what you need as a player, and you could tell the rivalry right from the start of the game.
The Dutch began the game superbly.
Our tactic was to surprise our opponents in the first 15 minutes, with lots of pressure, lots of movement and passing, all to try to score as quickly as possible. And that worked against Germany. Of course, it was a penalty, but Neeskens still had to score it.
It was an advantage for us, because after that, all the Dutch players thought they were already world champions. They started playing tricks and messing around.
We thought the Germans, they are not our friends. So let's humiliate them in front of their own fans. And then we lost the ball suddenly. And in no other game did we let a player just run with the ball. And suddenly, we let him run nearly half the length of the pitch to our own penalty area. And Janssen didn't even touch him, but it was a penalty.
I wanted to be world champion, and I knew we had no penalty takers, and no one wanted to take one. So I put it on the spot, and it was very clear to me. I'm going to smack the ball in the net.
Just before half-time, the Germans took the lead.
The ball came in from their right wing, our left. I blocked the first cross, and then it came back to Muller. I tried to stand tall to block it. He didn't make a great connection, but that was his style. It went through my legs and into the corner, and well, that was a real shame.
In the second half, the Dutch had no option but to attack.
They kept attacking, and we had to concentrate so much. Sepp Maier was outstanding. Sepp Maier won the game for us with impossible saves. These are the small details that decide a game, that can decide a World Cup.
We missed such a lot of chances, So we played quite well, but the details were not there. And you saw it in too many small, different details. And one of the things were scoring the goals.
For the Dutch, it was a missed opportunity. The West Germans were world champions.
For me, that moment was just so great. When you hear the full-time whistle, and you know you've won 2-1, and you're the world champions.
Without Gerd Müller, Germany would not have been European and world champions. We would have had some successful teams and successes, especially compared to the Dutch national team. They have always had great teams, but never won anything. Something important, because they didn't have a Gerd Müller.
Maybe we were a bit too sure of ourselves. I think that could well have played a part. It was just a shame we didn't win the final. We kind of forgot we had to win. It was such a shame.
In '74, most Dutch people didn't actually feel this intense sorrow that they later built up. '74 became a trauma later, not on the day itself.
The two nations met again in the 1978 World Cup and the 1980 European Championship. And by now there was no mistaking the extent of their rivalry.
Holland were always tough to play against. They don't like the Germans. And it's the same on our side. They were good games, tough games. It stems from history. We just don't like each other. And this was passed on from generation to generation. On the pitch, we want to win and fight against each other.
Off the pitch, too, the war was being revisited. In both countries, new generations were learning about the darkest chapter in their nation's histories.
Enough time had passed that people were able to talk about the war. For a start, the war was cast as this resistance story, and so you got movies and books and television programs about resistance fighters talking about how Holland had been good, and you got statues built to those people. May the 5th, which is Day of Liberation, became a national holiday again in the early 80s. I was at school in Holland in the 70s and 80s, and the war was suddenly all around you. You were being taught about it all the time, about how bad the Germans had been, how good on the whole the Dutch had been. So that was the story that my generation imbibed.
Against this backdrop, fate intervened when the two nations met again at the 1988 European Championship, held in West Germany.
Most Dutch people did see Holland-Germany matches as a rerun of World War II. Ridiculous, but that was very widely felt.
A lot of people in Holland didn't really forget the '74 World Champion finals. And for them it was very important.
Everybody had the feeling from '74. I was a young boy of 14 and I was crying on the couch at home.
For me, still, this game is the most important game I've ever played in my career.
It was a match with a lot of battles, tension, duels, and it was, well, dubious. And then Germany scored, and it was 1-0. After that, something happened in the group, and the battles on the pitch became harder. And we realised we could do something here.
Before it started from the back, and everybody was moving, and I was standing in the gap, and Ronald Koeman find the gap, and it was 2-3 passes, and we were in front of the goal of Germany.
It was 2-1, we won in the last minute. The fact that we were winning against Germany, okay, that is something what gives more to the victory.
For everybody in Holland, it was the revenge of '74.
I can't describe that feeling. It felt like free, kind of freedom, something you achieved you never expected.
It was a very, very bitter loss for us. But the Dutch at the time, they were the best.
Holland-Germany '88 was a rare example of players actually absorbing the public passion and hatred and really hating the other team. Ronald Koeman swapped shirts after the game with Olaf Thon, one of the German players, and afterwards Koeman pretended to wipe his bottom on the shirt.
We thought it was funny. It's not a great thing to do, but these things happen.
That added to the Dutch joy in a way that our players had become fans too, that our players felt it in the same way that we did at home. In Holland, millions of people came out onto the streets celebrating, singing. There was this song, in 1940 they came, in 1988 we came, and people threw their bicycles into the air, shouted, "We got our bicycles back," because Germans had impounded all Dutch bikes at some point in the war.
It was at that point that the Germans realized that there was this massive thing in Holland about Germany. It was the players' reaction, it was the media's reaction, and it was also the side of the ground which was filled with Holland fans. You really had this feeling that it was suddenly about more than just, getting into the final.
The people who were watching on TV, they thought, finally, we've got our revenge.
For Germany, the situation was made even worse as their most bitter rivals went on to win the European Championship. Just a year later, the two sides met in Rotterdam in what was supposed to be a friendly.
Both the Dutch and the German hooligans were among the most feared on the continent, and that would eventually spill over. It had to happen, and there were some nasty scenes when the two teams met in Rotterdam. The Dutch fans displayed a banner about Matthäus, which linked him to fascism, to Germany's Nazi past. But Germans don't really find that particularly funny. So that, of course, garnered a lot of bad press and fueled the fire, so that played a role in the build-up to 1990.
1990 saw Holland and Germany meet once more in the knockout stage of the World Cup in Italy. And each side was fully aware of exactly what was at stake.
You notice it in the dressing room. Everyone is more wound up and more nervous when you play Holland. For us, it's something really very special. You never ever want to lose against Holland.
The Germans were ready, but the Dutch were not.
The players didn't get behind the coaches that were chosen, and that had a negative impact. We didn't prepare very well, and we couldn't play like we did in '88.
In an ill-tempered game, this showed, particularly in the case of Frank Rijkaard.
I just had a really, really bad day, irritated. And he claimed to be fouled by me, and it wasn't like that. And I took my second yellow card, which meant that I couldn't play the next game. And so I showed my emotion absolutely in the wrong way. it's not what I represented during my career, because I like fair play, but that was a great mistake.
For the Germans, one of the defining moments was Frank Rijkaard spitting at Rudi Völler. You know, that may have been the moment when this was, because it was such a strong image. Even Germans would have understood if he'd spit at Lothar Matthäus or somebody. But Völler was, you know, such a nice fellow. He seemed such a nice fellow. So for Germans, that game encapsulates the rivalry.
It was an absolute injustice. And we said that we had to go on and win it for Rudi. So at half-time, we got back in the dressing room and we were really motivated by what Frank Rijkaard had done. And that was the best motivation, to make us even better and to go on and win the game.
The Germans went on to win the game 2-1.
10 against 10 with a lot of space and a lot of running, and the Germans are simply better in running than the Dutch. Physically, they were simply a little better than we at that time.
That was, of course, the best way to get our revenge, because we were in a World Cup, and the loss in the European Championships in 1988 really hurt us. So we were determined to beat the Dutch in the World Cup finals in Italy.
Just as the Netherlands had done 2 years earlier, Germany went on to greater glory, winning the World Cup. 2 years later in Sweden, the old foes were brought together once again, as the pair were drawn in the same group at Euro 92. The villain in 1990, Frank Rijkaard, opened the scoring for the Dutch. Midfielder Rob Witschke soon made it 2-0. Jürgen Klinsmann pulled one back for the Germans, before Dennis Bergkamp sealed a 3-1 win for Holland.
The game itself, I didn't feel it was as nasty as in 88 and 90, where it was more of a battle, more tension and more conflict.
It was classic Dutch, because we were the better team. We'd smashed them in the first round, and then you know, we got knocked out in the semis due to arrogance, because there was the idea that playing Denmark was like playing a cafe team, and it was only a question of how many goals we were going to score against Germany in the final. The stands at the Holland-Denmark match were half empty because Dutch people were planning to come for the final instead, and the Danes quite rightly knocked us out.
Germany and Holland had met in 3 successive major tournaments, but they would not be paired together again until Euro 2004, when they drew 1-1. And during that time, the rivalry had taken a less heated path.
From about the mid to late 90s, Dutch historians and newspapers started to say, you know what, we weren't really very good in the war. I mean, there were a few Dutch people who were in the resistance, but most Dutch people lived a rather grey existence, keeping their heads down, not getting into trouble, and helping the Germans deport 80% of Dutch Jews. So from the mid-90s, the realisation began to dawn that the war had not been a story of bad Germans against good Dutch. I mean, the Dutch had deeply collaborated, many of them, and that made it harder to see Germany as this horrible enemy.
It was a very black page in history. But I don't believe that you have to still play with this sentiment.
The two sides met at Euro 2012, when Germany won 2-1. Their rivalry may have cooled, but when Germany meet Holland, there is always an edge.
It's calmed down. Feelings used to run very high. In those days, it was more severe. But we all know what happened in the past, so the rivalry will remain.